Let me welcome to the stage my friend, Tim Burton. Give him a hand, please.
Well, thank you for coming out. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. I work for an organization called Wall Builders. We do a lot with American history, and specifically looking at some of the things that make us unique as a nation. We study our constitutional and moral religious heritage of the nation. I'll try to get out for the speakers a little bit, maybe that helps. But one of the things that we love to do is really help explain to people how special our nation is. In an era where we hear all the negatives about our nation, we oftentimes don't hear the positives. And undoubtedly, even as we're looking at an election right now, we're trying to choose someone that can help solve some of the problems in our nation. So we're not ignorant to the fact there are problems in the nation, and we want to choose a leader that will help correct those problems in the nation. But even as we talk about problems in America, the problems that we are experiencing in America, not like problems much of the rest of the world experiences when we talk about problems, and it's because our nation really is unique. We're unlike any other nation in the world, and it's because what the Founding Fathers did when they built this nation, when they established us as a nation, what they did, their guiding philosophy and principles made us different than anywhere else. For example, if you look this last year at the United Nations, there was 195 member nations present. Well, of the 195 member nations present, America was one of the only nations who did not average a revolution every 30 to 40 years, which is remarkable to consider. That most nations of the world, every 30 to 40 years, go through turnover, they go through revolution. We enjoy such stability in America, we can't imagine that. And by the way, with our stability in our entire existence, we've only had one constitution. Well, when you start looking at the rest of the world, you understand how special that is, because France went through revolution the same time we did. They've had 15 constitutions, and this is just standard as you look around the rest of the world. Nobody enjoys the stability we enjoy as Americans. In fact, Russia, one of the top nations in the world today, they've had 4 since 1918. Poland, if you're 95 years old in Poland, you've had 7 different constitutions. In fact, even South Korea, one of the top 10 economic producers in the world today, they've had 6 constitutions over the last 60 plus years. Nobody in the world has enjoyed the stability we've enjoyed as Americans. And as Americans, we don't just enjoy stability. You know, we're a very creative nation. This is something most people don't really think about, but we only make up 4% of the world's population. But every single year, we have more inventions, more patents, more medical cures, more medical discoveries. We even write more symphonies every single year than the rest of the 96% of the world combined. Our 4% of the population does that. It's amazing. And by the way, we also enjoy an unprecedented prosperity. With only 4% of the world's population, we account for 25% of the world's wealth, or the GDP. We are a very blessed nation, and by the way, to understand how blessed we are even with this notion of finances and prosperity, the U.S. Census Bureau, according to their last study, they looked at it, and obviously we know how they monitor and what they do and where they level, but what they identified is that if you live below the poverty line in America, now I'll tell you as an individual, I don't want anybody to live in poverty. I think if you take your God-given gifts, talents, abilities, in a nation where you have freedom and opportunity, if you work really hard, you can be productive. And I want everybody to be productive and to enjoy the benefits of prosperity in America. But let's say that you are in poverty in America, or in this case, you live below the poverty line. So you're not just out of the poverty line, you're below the poverty line. In America, you are still more likely to have a telephone, to have a television, to have your own air conditioner, to have your own vehicle, to eat more red meat, and have more square footage of living space than if you lived in the middle class in Europe, and Western Europe is the second wealthiest place in the world. You're better off in poverty in America than middle class in the second richest place in the world. Well, then it's no wonder we have an immigration problem. Because people have discovered if we can go live in poverty in America, we will have significantly improved our lifestyle. Well, this is the reality of what we do, and most Americans don't recognize. By the way, do you know how American poverty is defined? It's defined as a family of 4 making $43,000 or less. That's how we define poverty in America. Now, if you go to a third world nation, do you know how you define poverty? Do you know on average 1/4 of the world makes $1.25 a day? Half the world makes less than $2 a day. And poverty in America is $43,000. Our poverty is not like anybody else. See, America is a special place, and this is what we used to know. In fact, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America in the 1830s, he's the one, by the way, that wrote the famous book, Democracy in America. When he came in the 1830s, he said, America is a really special place. He says, in fact, no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one as what the current Americans have. Now, what was significant for Alexis de Tocqueville is he wasn't just a philosopher, he actually was in charge of the prison system over in France. So he came to America and he wanted to see, how is America so different than we are? Because remember the prison system of France, their system of government was defined by something very unique. They had a different enforcement mechanism than what we had in America. In fact, in France, when the revolution started, they actually executed 40,000 people with the guillotine. So this was pretty standard over in France. Well, America looked a lot different. In fact, James Kent was known as the father of American jurisprudence. He's the one that helped establish the court system in America, the philosophies that we follow in court. This is the guy that helped lay those out. Well, he was actually a Supreme Court justice for the state of New York, and at the time, New York was the biggest state in the nation, and so actually the New York Supreme Court was arguably even more important than the U.S. Supreme Court because they had that high volume, high level of cases, and what they did really made a difference for the rest of the nation. Well, he was there for 16 years. In 16 years, he tried 1,755 cases, so he was involved on a lot of cases. Well, it's really interesting, in one of his writings, he talked about how he was afraid that America was on the edge, corruption forefront, because we were having a crime wave in America, and he was referencing the fact that we had seen way too many murders in America. Now, perspective, because I'm going to ask you how many murders happen. So perspective, in Chicago there's a murder every 8 to 10 hours. In New York City there's a murder every 10 to 12 hours. He says he thought we were on the edge of a crime wave because of how many murders he saw. In 16 years on the court, guess how many murders he saw?
10?
Not a lot. Yeah, actually less than 10, it was only 8. That's a murder every other year. Every other year there's a murder, and he says, oh, we got problems. We've got a crime wave. Oh, that we would have the same kind of crime wave. This would be an amazing problem, but see, this is why when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, he says, what you guys do here, it's a lot different than where we are. What you do, it's so special here, and he identified so many things that made it special, but Alexis de Tocqueville is where we get the phrase known as American exceptionalism. Because he said the position of the Americans is quite exceptional. Well, we used to understand America's not like the other nations of the world, and today we're trying to make America like other nations of the world because we don't recognize how special what we have actually is. But what's unique is when you look at this notion of American exceptionalism, it's actually pretty easy to document how we became such a special nation. And so the question I'm going to address tonight is that philosophy that produced American exceptionalism, and what we need to do is define this term. Because if we talk about American exceptionalism, a lot of professors today in universities, a lot of talking heads in media, they don't like the term American exceptionalism. Because how dare you say America's special? In fact, I had a discussion with a college professor, talking with students, and this professor said, well, you can't say America's special because, well, didn't we have slavery? And I said, well, we did. But can you name a nation that didn't have slavery? You can't. And by the way, can you name a nation that fought a civil war to end slavery? There's one. So even your example is broken, because I can even take your example and prove I'm still right. However, the conflict was lying in the fact that we didn't define American exceptionalism the same way. And so for the sake of our discussion tonight, I want you to define American exceptionalism. And as we use the term American exceptionalism, it describes the unprecedented stability, freedom, and prosperity that is a result of the institutions and policies produced by a unique governing philosophy. So when we say we're exceptional, it's because of the freedom, stability, and prosperity that came from the institutions that was really the thought of the philosophy and goes back to this unique philosophy that we have that wasn't like anywhere else in the world. Now, what we know is because we had a unique philosophy, we built the institutions, we did the organization, the structure that we did, and from that we enjoy all the benefits that we enjoy today. And so as we talk about what makes America special, what you really need to understand is that the philosophy that produced everything else we did. And it's very much like being someone that lives in the country, this example makes sense to me. If you think of a fruit tree, if you enjoy the fruit of the tree, well, if you want more of that kind of fruit, what you need to know is not just, hey, this is a good apple. No. You need to know what was the seed that was planted, because the seed that was planted is what gave you the fruit that you enjoy. Well, see, the seed that was planted, that was our philosophy of government. And from that philosophy grew the structure, the institutions and policies, and from the institutions and policies is where we get the fruit that we enjoy. So if we enjoy the freedom, the stability, the prosperity, and all the other things we could add to the list, the question we ought to ask is, what was the seed that was planted that grew and produced all that we enjoy today? And so this is the question I want to address tonight, is what was the philosophy that produced this American exceptionalism? And I think if you want to address this, you have to go back to the Declaration. It's known as our birth certificate. In 126 words, the Founding Fathers laid out 5 immutable principles they thought the way government should operate. And you see it very clearly in the Declaration. And in fact, a lot of phrases that you would recognize. Things like, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator. What we acknowledge, our philosophy of government acknowledges that, number one, there is a divine Creator. So in the midst of everything else, we believe there is a God. Now this is vital because the rest of your philosophy will go one way or the other based on whether or not you believe there's a God or not. Because if you believe there's a God, then there's certain things that follow. If there's no God, then you can pretty much go whatever direction you want to go. And let me point out that this wasn't just the thought of Thomas Jefferson who drafted the Declaration. This was done in the unanimous consent of the 13 United States of America. So all 13 states agreed on this, and it's significant to point out that when you look at the Declaration, there's 27 agreements listed. Do you know when Jefferson first drafted the Declaration, there was more than 27 grievances? And they removed grievances that not all the states agreed with. In fact, one of the grievances that Jefferson originally wrote was that the King of England will not allow us to free our slaves in America. Because even before we signed the Declaration, there were 4 northern states that had all tried to pass laws to abolish slavery, and the King had vetoed all those laws. So Jefferson in the Declaration says the King will not allow us to free our slaves. Well, there were 3 southern states there, and they said, no, we're not trying to free our slaves. It's too important to our economy. We need to maintain our slaves. So that was removed from the Declaration. Well, the reason I point that out as being significant is because what is in the Declaration is only what all 13 states agreed upon. And they all agreed upon the fact that there is a divine creator. And this is something we see even carried out with George Washington. When he became the president in 1789, he had the very first ever presidential prayer proclamation. We actually have an original copy of that first presidential prayer proclamation, a really neat document. And in this, he's calling the nation to pray as a president, saying, okay, guys, here's what we need to do. But he explains why he thought as a nation we needed to pray. And here's what he said to the nation. He says, it is the duty. And I'm going to stop there and highlight the word duty. Because as you read history, one of the things that's significant to know is words sometimes change over time. If you look up the word duty in a modern dictionary, it says something that ought to be done. If you look up the word duty in Webster's 1828 dictionary, it says it's a legally binding, morally contractual obligation. So it's a little stronger than just something you ought to do. It's, no, you are legally, morally bound to do this. Washington says it is the duty, and notice who he says who has a duty. It's the duty of nations. Now, that's significant because he's talking about God, and he says it's the duty not of Christians, but of nations, and there's 4 things he said. To acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. He said as a nation, we have 4 duties. And he lays out, we have a responsibility, but the reason we have a responsibility is because there is a God, and because there's a God, there's subsequent things that follow, and not just for Christians, because whether you're a Christian or not, there's a God. You don't have to believe in Him, He's still there. So it's a duty, and it's the duty of nations. It's very interesting what he outlined in this first presidential prayer proclamation, but it goes back to what we acknowledged in the Declaration. We believe there is a divine creator. Well, the second thing we outlined in the Declaration is that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. We believe that we have inalienable rights and they come from God. Now, the phrase inalienable right is actually a God-given right, but today most people don't know what that phrase is. So just logically, if we said, okay, well, what's an inalienable right? We don't use that phrase today. Well, the founding fathers were pretty clear on this. In fact, John Dickinson was the brigadier general during the Revolution, was actually the governor of Delaware. He actually went on to sign the Constitution, so he's a major founding father, part of so much going on, and he explained what an inalienable right was. He said, it's a right which God gave to you, and which no inferior power has a right to take away. Every power is inferior to God. So if God's given you a right, nobody and nothing can take it away from you. It is pretty plain. It's a God-given right, and nobody else can touch it. Then you have Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the aide-de-camp to Washington during the Revolution. He actually is a member of the Constitutional Convention, signs the Constitution, then goes on, one of the co-authors of the Federalist Papers. So he's another guy very involved in this. Well, he explained what an inalienable right was. He wrote, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the aid of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. So pretty plain. It's something that God has done. Nobody else can touch it. They can't take it away. But I think the best definition actually came from John Adams. John Adams, a name surely we recognize, the second president, the first vice president, signed the Declaration. But John Adams explained something very interesting. He said, inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly governments. Rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. Now, he acknowledges that these are rights that come from God, but he says something really interesting at the beginning. He says they are antecedent to all earthly governments. Now, you think about even from the Bible, when did God give rights to man? Well, from the Bible, you'd have to say it was Adam and Eve in the garden. Well, when did God establish government? Well, the very first ever civil ordinance God gave was in the Noahide laws, or the Noahic covenant, and that was in Genesis 8 when Noah lands on Mount Ararat, and God gives the very first ever civil ordinance that says, if man says sheds blood, by man his blood shall be shed. That was the very first ever civil ordinance God gave. Well, that was a long time after the Garden of Eden. John Adams points out, government existed after God gave rights, therefore government cannot regulate or dictate the rights that God gave you. Well, what a great conclusion, but this is what the Founding Fathers understood very well. So if we know it's a God-given right, the question we ought to ask is, what are those inalienable or God-given rights? And again, the Founding Fathers explained this. In fact, Sam Adams, known as the father of the Revolution, very involved throughout the Revolution, but he explained something interesting. He says, first, a right to life, secondly, to liberty, thirdly, property. Now, we know life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We don't generally recognize property, but if you look at the early debates, most of the debates were about property. Because under the king, there was no private property. The king thought he owned everything. In fact, there's some eminent domain talk today, which is kind of scary. We're trying to get to where we can have possessions and we can be in charge and we can be our own boss. But it used to be known as the American dream. You can have your own home. Well, that's what the Founding Fathers said. First, you have the right to life, then to liberty, and thirdly, to property. Well, one of the things we acknowledge is that those were just the first of the rights. We said there's even more rights, and that's what part of the Bill of Rights was about. Because we said you have the right to freedom of speech and the freedom of religion, which is the rights of conscience, and the freedom to defend yourself and protect your private property and your own possessions. And we went through and said there's more rights. And in Amendment 9, there's even more rights that we didn't list. And then Amendment 10 is, well, actually, the states actually get to have some rights, because if it's not laid out in the federal Constitution, the federal government can't touch it. We acknowledge there's a whole bunch of rights we have, even more than what was just written down. But it goes back to this notion, we believed in the concept of inalienable rights, which was God-given rights. So we started off acknowledging there is a God. God has given us rights. And number 3, we said that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The reason we have government exists to protect our God-given inalienable rights. Now that's a very significant thing to note, because today, government thinks that they are the ones that gives rights. They get to dictate what the rights are and regulate what those rights are. No. Your job is to protect the rights God's already given you. That's why you exist. Well, that's what the Founding Fathers believed. And to this end, the Founding Fathers were very open about this. In fact, James Wilson, he was one of only 6 guys that signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He actually was an original U.S. Supreme Court justice put there by George Washington, and he started the very first organized law training in America. So if you wanted to go to a law school in early America, he was the option. Well, he wrote the very first law books in America. We actually have those law books, which are really cool. But in the law books, he explained to his students the purpose of government. Here's what he told them. He said, the principal object of government was to acquire a new security for the possession of those rights which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise and all-beneficent Creator. The reason government exists is to protect the rights that God has already given us. Well, Sam Adams followed that sentiment very similarly. This is what he explained. He said, government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable right. The reason government exists is to protect our rights. And this actually is where we get the phrase, he says, first, a right to life, secondly, to liberty, and thirdly, to property. He explained the reason government exists is to protect these rights. Now, what's interesting about what Sam Adams says is he uses the phrase like right to life. Right to life is a phrase that we use today. Only we use it for something possibly different than what they use it for. When we talk about a right to life today, we're very clearly talking about the issue of abortion. And one of the things that's interesting for us is so often the debate goes around the intent of the law. And so if you could look back in history, the Founding Fathers would have said the right to life is actually the right to life. The unborn, if they would have laid that out, it would have been so much easier for us to say, no, personhood, right to life, that the unborn, that's part of it. But today it's so skewed. Well, and part of the problem is that abortion is a more modern concept. Now, as I'm saying that, I'm tricking you because it's not. One of the things that we've fallen kind of under the trick of is thinking that we are discovering things, brand new things. Well, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Do you know under Bill Clinton was the first time that the U.S. military ever dealt with homosexuals in the military? Except it wasn't. George Washington kicked someone out of his military in the American Revolution for an act of sodomy, actually had a full-page write-up of the dangers of allowing homosexuality or sodomy into the military, how it would degrade the military, would decrease the morals in the military. We think we deal with things that are brand new. Now, what's significant about this, you talk about a right to life. You know we have a book in our library from 1808 on observations on abortion? I thought that was 1973, Roe versus Wade. I thought that was a new issue. No, there's nothing new under the sun. As long as there have been girls getting pregnant, there were girls that didn't want to be pregnant. Now, our technology certainly has changed. But the philosophy hasn't changed. So actually, when the Founding Fathers talk about a right to life, they literally are still dealing with a lot of the issues we're dealing with today. In fact, James Wilson, I mentioned, has the first organized law school in America. Do you know he told his law students about this notion of a right to life? Here's what he told them. He says, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life, from its commencement to its close, is protected by the common law. Now, the common laws we operate on in America today. And he says, students, you have to know life in America is protected under the law from beginning to the end. Well, if we know it's protected, the only discussion we can have is when does life begin and when does life end? That's the only discussion we can have. Well, he explained this for his students. He says, in the contemplations of law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb. By the law, that life is protected. Now, here's what's interesting about this, because think about context. He says, students, as soon as that baby's stirring in the womb, the laws in America protect the life of that unborn child. Now, when the baby stirs in the womb today, that's a little more advanced, but here's what's interesting thinking about context. In the Founding Fathers era, there was no stick you could pee on that would turn a color. So when did you know you were pregnant? When it first stirs in the womb. By argument of what he's saying is as soon as a woman knows she's pregnant, the laws in America protect that life. That's amazing. As soon as we know, this is followed up. John Witherspoon, at the end of the Revolution, France is going through revolution. So he goes over, several Founding Fathers actually went over to France. We had made friends during our American Revolution with several people over in France. So a lot of Founding Fathers went over to try to help them in France resolve and figure things out and do things. Well, John Witherspoon was a signer of the Declaration, actually was a president of Princeton University, single-handedly helped train more Founding Fathers than any other individual or school, a really remarkable guy, and you can see from his collar, he was a pastor. Well, John Witherspoon, when he went over to France, he talked about how our idea of liberty in America is different than in France, because France, they love the idea of liberty, but if you remember the French Revolution, it was liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's what they believed in. And so John Witherspoon goes over and says, we have a different thought on this notion of liberty. He explained, a perfect right in a state of natural liberty is the right to life. He addressed, in France, you guys don't value life quite the same that we do in America. In America, we really value life. We value the unborn. And he explained where there's a difference. In America, we've denied the power of life and death to parents. He said, in America, we don't let mom and dad decide whether or not they're going to keep the baby. The mom and dad's choice was what they did in order to get the baby. But once you're pregnant, we understand in America that you're not the originator of life. You're not the creator. You're not the one that does this, so we don't give you the power to take it away. That's an amazing thought. He says, this is how we're different from you in France, and if you want to have this perfect liberty, then you need to respect the life of the unborn. This is an amazing thought, but it does go back to this notion of what Sam Adams says. First is the right to life. The very first thing we protect in America is the unborn. And by the way, why is that the first of the inalienable rights, or the first right that we want to protect? Well, you can argue very easily and logically is that if you don't first protect the right to life, none of the other rights matter because you're not alive to enjoy it. So you have to protect the life first. And what's interesting about this argument is, the way someone views a right to life will reveal to you a lot about their perspective and worldview on almost everything else. Because if you cannot acknowledge that God is the author, the giver of life, that life comes from God, then you probably also don't believe that we ought to be able to acknowledge publicly that God that gave us life. See, I can tell where someone is on almost every single social issue based on the way they view a right to life. Because the right to life reveals their worldview. And by the way, as we're talking about even politicians, you want to know where they're going to stand on the issue? Look at where they're on the right to life. How well do they defend the unborn? And it will reveal to you their worldview, which reveals a lot of other things. If someone won't believe that God's the author, the giver, the creator, sustainer of life, then they probably also don't believe in my God-given right of self-defense. Because why should I be able to defend and value the life of my wife or my kids, myself? But you know what? If you believe that God's the author and giver of life, you believe that life is sacred and therefore it's valuable and therefore you ought to be able to protect it. Because it's important. I can tell you the way someone's even going to view something like marriage based on the way you view your right to life. Because if you don't believe God's the author and giver of life, you also don't believe that marriage is a sacred covenant. that was established in the Garden of Eden between one man and one woman. And by the way, we've got some candidates running right now that say, hey, U.S. Supreme Court's already ruled. It's now the law of the land, which really is frightening to me about how much of basic government we don't know. The Supreme Court doesn't create law. That's not what the judicial branch does. We have a legislative branch that creates law. All the Supreme Court, all any judge can do is offer an opinion. Do you know the Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism? So even if they say, hey, marriage is now this, they can't enforce it. And one of the things we've done in Texas, Greg Abbott, is, and actually there's several, he's already signed some things into law in this effect, but we have several state legislators that are working to say, we will not use our state funds to enforce any laws that are unconstitutional that come down from executive orders or Supreme Court. God bless Texas. It's great to be here. But here's what's interesting is, do you know, if you can't acknowledge the right to life, you're not going to acknowledge marriage the right way either. But if you do acknowledge the right to life, there's a lot better chance you acknowledge marriage. And by the way, this is generally the way it works, even something as simple as private property. Because if you don't believe in the value of the unborn, that God's the author, giver, the sovereign over life, then you probably don't believe in the Ten Commandments, which says don't steal and don't covet what somebody else's. I wish we had more government officials that believed in that notion. It would solve a lot of the EPA, a lot of the Bureau of Land Management, a lot of eminent domain, a lot of problems we deal with today because government doesn't respect the fact that we can have private property. But you know what? I already knew what they were going to view because of the way they view the right to life. It was already going to reveal it to me. Now, I do understand that what we're talking about are largely social issues. And I understand there's a lot of people that social are not what really drives us. There's a lot of other things, whether it's immigration or whether one of the big things it used to be is economics. There's a lot of other things that drive us. And let me just point out, I understand that those are really big issues. I really do. If you look at our nation today, economics, we're over $19 trillion in debt. We had over $2 billion every single day to national deficit. With unfunded liabilities, we're over $250 trillion in debt. It's astronomical and idiotic what we are doing. It makes no sense at all. So I understand if someone's concerned with economics. But I'm going to go back again and say the most important thing is the right to life. Now, there's a group called National Right to Life that actually, they will track our current elected officials. And one of the things they do, they'll go to Congress, and they'll look at Congress, and the only thing they care about is the right to life. But they will track and see who does the very best job of voting to defend life. And they will give you a list of who is the very best on defending life. Now, this is a list from last year. These are the people that scored the very highest on defending life. Well, National Right to Life is one of many groups that will track issues. And if you care about the Second Amendment, you have the NRA, or whether you care about the environment, or whatever topic you pick, there are groups that do nothing but track that single issue. Well, there's groups that do nothing but track economic issues. For example, if you look at groups like Americans for Prosperity, all they do is track the people that are the best economic representatives. And so when they give you a list of the very best economic representatives, here's the people they say are the very best. Now, I don't know if you see a connection yet. Because maybe it's just a coincidence. Well, so what if we look at the worst representatives in the issue of life, and then we look at the worst economic representatives, and you compare those two lists, you know what's amazing? Is they line up every single time. Without fail. So when people tell me, well, economics is what I care about, I say, well, then you care about life. Because it's the best indicator, even of economics, and here's the principle. If they won't protect your life, they won't protect your money. It's not confusing, but it really does go back. See, why did the Founding Fathers say first it's a right to life? Because whether you care about social issues or economic issues, the very best indicator is a right to life. It reveals where someone's going to be on the other issues. And so even as we talk about our elected officials, who are we going to vote for? Who are we going to choose? You know, the right to life is one of the very best things you can look for. Now, I'll tell you as a Christian, there's some other things I look for because one of the things the Bible tells us is that righteousness is what exalts a nation. Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, you seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And then everything else gets added. Well, as Christians, we should be concerned with the issue of righteousness. Well, so if you look at all the issues we're dealing with today, how do we determine what's more righteous than another? Well, if you go to the Old Testament, when God led the Israelites out of Egypt, God has to set up a whole new system of government for them, and God gives the Israelites 613 commands the way they should live and operate and regulate their lives. But of those 613 commands, God actually boiled down and He had a top 10. Now the reason we know that is because He wrote those in stone. That was different than anything else. 10 of them He wrote in stone. Well, do you know what He wrote in stone? He wrote things like, you shall not murder. Do you know murder is shedding innocent blood? And by the way, murder and killing, two totally different concepts. right? Killing is shedding blood, murder, shedding innocent blood. King David was praised for killing Goliath. He got in trouble for murdering Uriah. Totally different concepts. Well, God says, I am against the shedding of innocent blood. Well, do you know, a right to life is the issue of shedding innocent blood? Abortion is shedding innocent blood. So if God says, don't shed innocent blood, you know abortion made God's top 10? In fact, go to the very next command, you shall not commit adultery. What is God trying to protect? The institution of marriage, which is defined as one man and one woman. By the way, Jesus in Matthew 19 said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be joined with his wife, and two become one flesh, and what God put together, one man and one woman, let nobody come against. You know, the Bible even talks about marriage. And by the way, some people say, well, what's not the Ten Commandments? Okay, let's go back to commandment number 5. Honor your father and mother. We've just outlined the family structure, the family unit. Because God could have said, honor your parents. He didn't. He outlined family, mother and father. Very clear. Well, you know, one of the things in the Ten Commandments, we call it the prologue. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Do you know the Jews actually don't say it's a prologue? They say that's the very first command. I am the Lord your God. They say that's the first command, because if you can't acknowledge He's the Lord your God, nothing else matters. Well, that's a good point. You have to acknowledge He's God. But as they point out, you have to be able to acknowledge He's God. Well, you know, there's a lot of places now that don't want you to acknowledge God. You can't do it in public schools. You can't do it at high school football games. You can't do it at city council meetings. So religious liberty, public religious acknowledgement is another thing you could argue made the top 10. So just if you look at the 10 Commandments, you have life, you have marriage, you have religious liberty. Those are very important issues. So as a Christian, if I am concerned with the issue of righteousness, I'm going to look and see, first of all, where do you stand on those 3 issues? Because everything else will fall below that. God does care about the economy. God gave some great economic. Jesus taught more parables on money than any other topic. He cares about economics. Just didn't make the top 10. Do you know God has standards of caring for the poor, of helping those in need? All of those are in the Bible. They just didn't make the top 10. What is issues of righteousness are life and marriage and religious liberty. And so as I'm going to vote, I'm going to find someone that's going to do a really good job on those 3 issues. And if you're not going to do a good job on those 3 issues, I'm going to try to find somebody who will do a good job on those 3 issues. See, even voting is not as complicated as we make it, but the Founding Fathers says the very first right is the right to life. That has to be what we acknowledge first, because government was created to protect our God-given rights. Well, the 4th thing we acknowledge is that to assume among the powers of the earth the separate equal station in which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them. Now, the phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, outlined for every early American the notion of a fixed moral law, because we all knew what that meant. We knew that there are certain standards that God has revealed in the laws of nature, in the laws of nature's God. That phrase was very well known in early America, because it came from Blackstone's Commentaries on Laws of England. William Blackstone wrote those laws, and the Founding Fathers, actually, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson both said the Founding Fathers studied Blackstone like Muslims study the Quran, which was pretty serious at the time. So Americans really know Blackstone. Well, Blackstone outlined what the laws of nature and nature's God was. Blackstone said everything you need to know about life, God has revealed to you in creation, in nature, and in the laws of nature's God, which is the Bible. Everything you need to know, just look around you. You know, it's an interesting point he makes is that there's a lot of things you can learn about God just by looking at the laws of nature. For example, do you know the laws of nature? If you take something like the issue of self-defense, if you did nothing but study nature, study creation, if you looked at animals, would you get the impression that God has put in us the right, ability, and inclination to defend ourselves? Yes. And by the way, the Bible even talks about it. A bear robbed of her cubs. You don't want to meet that bear robbed of her cubs, because mama bear, claws, fangs, it's coming after you. But here's what's unique. We try to pass laws to regulate a law of nature. Do you know it doesn't matter how many laws you pass against bears or lions, they're still going to defend their cubs. It's a law of nature. See, we can know God has put in us the ability to defend ourselves. By the way, I was a youth pastor for 10 years. I was a high school coach for 12 years. I'm still doing some coaching on the side. And there's more mama bears than just what you see in the woods.
Oh, yeah.
Their little precious feels threatened. Oh my goodness. I mean, claws out, they're coming after you. God put in us something of self. See, I don't have to have the Bible to know self-defense is okay. Now, the Bible also confirms that. I'm going to talk about that later if you want to. But the Bible confirms it. But even if I didn't have the Bible, if I just studied nature, I could have an indication self-defense is something God put in us. That's something we can do. Well, you know what else you see from creation is this idea of liberty. Do you know there's more than 10 million species? And of the 10 million species, there's not a single species that enslaves another species. I can just look at nature and know that's not the way God intends it. Nothing. Now, by the way, as I point that out, one of the attacks against the Founding Fathers is that, well, they were all racists, and they were bigots, and they were slaveholders. I spoke actually at Texas Tech yesterday, and I was talking to a group of college students, and so I was talking about some of this issue of racism and slavery, and have you guys heard that? Absolutely, they've heard that. So the question always comes up, okay, well, if you look at the Founding Fathers, the 56 signers of the Declaration, if they're all racist and bigots and slaveholders, who of them owned slaves? Thomas Jefferson. Yes, he did. Who else? Yeah, Washington signed the Declaration. Now, the reason I will point that out is because if you go to people that didn't sign the Declaration, then you can include the framers of the Bill of Rights, you can include the signers of the Constitution, you can include the early generals or the early governors, but if you include all the Founding Fathers, there's 250 that would fall in that category. So now we've gone from 56 to 250. So in 250, we now have two, Jefferson and Washington. You have 248 left. And that's the response I got from the college students. I said, now here's what's interesting. Of the signers of the Declaration, 56, only 11 of them owned slaves. But 14 of them actually started or worked for abolition societies to free slaves. There were more Founding Fathers that were anti-slavery than that were pro-slavery. And by the way, some of them that owned slaves weren't even pro-slavery, and they weren't racist, and they weren't bigots. No true historian thinks George Washington was, because if you ever go to Mount Vernon, you will see his slaves lived better than any other American colonist did at the time. And he paid them, and he gave them their own portion of the property of Mount Vernon. They could grow their own crops, and they could sell them, they could trade them. It was not this notion that we think of today, that oftentimes we see in the South, that this brutality, even some of the Founding Fathers that owned slaves weren't these really bad guys we get. And the reason I point that out is because so often we hear this narrative about how negative it was. A lot of the Founding Fathers believed what we saw revealed in the laws of nature is that the state that God intends for man is to be free. We know it from Galatians. It's for freedom that Christ set us free. That's the condition God wants us to be in. We take something else. Take the issue of abortion. Of the more than 10 million species, there's not a single species that murders its young while it's still in the womb. Only humans do that. You can look at creation and know that's not the way God intended. See, just looking at creation, we would learn a lot of things, even something like homosexuality. Of the more than 10 million species, do you know there's no homosexual species? And I always like to make the joke, if there ever was, that's why it doesn't still exist. Now, some people argue, yeah, but you know what? And they can name 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different species where there is some homosexuality practiced in that species. But I will point out, that's always the aberration. In fact, those animals are never received well in the herd. The rest of the herd doesn't like it. That's not something they're up for. Well, you can just look at creation, the laws of nature, and know that's not the way God intended. Now, as I say that, my family, we have a farm, we have a ranch. I've seen the laws of nature in action, and that ain't the way it works. This is something, you can just look at the laws of nature, and you can see the way God intended. In fact, even property. Do you know, animals can be very territorial. They can guard, they can defend, because there's something in us that even animals believe there's a notion of property. They're going to protect what they think is theirs. Well, see, you can just look at nature and you can know there's a lot of things that God intended for what you see in nature. But one of the things that Blackstone pointed out, the Founding Fathers explained, is that if all you did was look at the laws of nature, you would get an incomplete picture, because there's some things in the laws of nature that it seems to indicate is acceptable in the laws of nature, but it's not acceptable in the laws of God. For example, the notion of theft. I was on our ranch a week and a half ago, and I was putting out feed for the horses. And we've got several horses, and we've got this really big trough that we feed them in, and so I'll put a little bit of, in different spots for the horses to come up. The problem is, I've got this one horse that thinks he is the king of the world. And he thinks he should have all of the food, and no horse should have any other food. He doesn't think theft is a problem. Well, that's pretty common in nature. Then animals don't seem to have a problem with theft. It's the law of the tiger and the shark. The biggest and strongest, the meanest, they're going to try to take it all. Well, you see that in nature pretty regularly. In fact, you also see adultery in nature. Do you know on our ranch, we have a bunch of heifers and only one bull? Because that's just the way it works in nature. Not so much a problem in nature. Do you know what else? Murder's not a problem in nature. One of our neighbors used to raise chickens, had these prize hens, and actually she had some major problems because there would be animals like a skunk would claw and dig and get in this pen, and it would go around killing the chickens, not eat them, just kill them. Because I like the taste of blood. I just thought that was a great thing. Well, you see in creation some things that don't seem to be consistent, but that's why Blackstone said, you don't just have the laws of nature, you also have the laws of nature's God, which is what we know as the Word of God. But if you look at the laws of nature's God, it says you don't steal, you don't commit adultery, you don't murder. Everything that might be confusing in nature is explained in the laws of nature's God, and that's why Blackstone said you have the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. The laws of nature's God is what we see outlined in the Bible, but this is what was known as the common law. Every American knew this. So when we see in the Declaration that the laws of nature, nature's God, it was outlining there is a standard God's given. And you see the standard in creation in the Word of God, but there's a fixed moral law. There are things that are absolute that God says this is right and that's wrong. Every American knew what that was. And so we outlined in our Declaration that we acknowledge there is a fixed moral law. Well, the fifth thing we said is governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. We acknowledge that in America, we believe we, the people, should be in charge. Well, we see in our Constitution, we are in charge. Well, this is something that no matter what party you were part of, you believe. George Washington was part of the Federalist Party. And as a Federalist, he explained that the fundamental principle of our Constitution enjoins that the will of the majority shall prevail. So we believe that the majority is what should prevail. Well, Thomas Jefferson was a member of the Anti-Federalist Party, so he's on the opposite side of the aisle. But even Jefferson acknowledges the will of the majority, the natural law of every society, is the only sure guardian of the rights of man. So both sides acknowledge that we believe in the rights of the people get to decide, the people get to choose. But I want you to notice when we believed the consent of the governed should take place. Because the consent of the governed is something we definitely believed in, but it only happened after we acknowledge, number one, there's a God. God has given us rights. The government's job is to protect those rights. We believe that God has set out a fixed moral law, and below that, we can choose things. And the reason that matters is because the consent of the governed can never outrank the hierarchy of the first four. For example, if 51% of Americans decide murder is now acceptable, it will not be acceptable because it violates the first four standards. It violates the fact that I have an inalienable right, and government's job is to protect that inalienable right, and it goes against a fixed moral law. So we didn't believe in just an open consent. We can choose whatever we want. It had to fall in sequence, but it was after we acknowledged there's a God who's given us rights. Government's job is to protect those rights. We believe that God has given us standards, but below that, we can choose. You can choose what kind of speed limit you want. You can choose how wide you want the sidewalks to be. There's a lot of things we can choose, but it can't violate those first four, what we believe are those inalienable, God-given, immutable principles. And what's interesting about this is it all hinges on the fact, notice the first four directly related to a God consciousness. If there's not a faith element, well, then you're going to have a problem. And this is what's interesting to notice. You look at nations around the world, do you know a secular government cannot be a limited government? Because there's only two options. Either you have a really big God, or you have a really big government. And there's no in between. And this is what you see when you look at the rest of the world. And by the way, when I say limited government, we're not referring to how big it is. Limited government is recognizing jurisdictional lines. Because in the Constitution, there's 17 things outlined in the Constitution that the federal government can do. And so if they're going to do those things, I don't mind them being big in the things they're doing. The problem is they start reaching into things that are not what they've been designed or created to do. And that's where we have a lot of problems. See, it's understanding what belongs to government and what doesn't. That's what we mean by jurisdictional lines. It's your job to do this. It's not your job to do that. Well, this is what we used to acknowledge in America. In fact, one of the things that Jesus explained is that we're supposed to render to Caesar what's Caesar's. We render to God what's God's. He acknowledged that there are different responsibilities. Caesar has some things, but God's got some things, and you can't cross those two. Well, we used to believe that in America. In fact, if you go back to a case that dealt with marriage, by the way, outlined very clearly in the Bible what marriage is, that God originated marriage. Whether you go to Genesis, whether you go to Matthew 19, it's very clear that God is the one that created marriage, and how God created marriage to function and operate, that's something that God did. That was not created by government, that was created by God. Well, because we knew that God was the originator of it, that fell in God's jurisdiction, not the government's jurisdiction. So if you go back to 1913, there's a case of Grigsby versus Reed, and the court actually was asked to rule on marriage. So when they were asked to rule on marriage, to try to redefine marriage, here's what the court said in 1913. Marriage was not originated by human law. When God created Eve, she was the wife to Adam. They then and there occupied the status of husband to wife and wife to husband. The truth is that civil government has grown out of marriage, which created homes and population, society, from which government became necessary. Marriages will produce a home and a family that will contribute to good society, to free and just government, and the support of Christianity. It would be sacrilegious to apply the designation of civil contract to such a marriage. It is that and more. It is a status ordained by God. Now, that's a little different than what the U.S. Supreme Court ruled last summer. But the problem is, the court has forgotten its jurisdiction. Government as a whole has forgotten. See, we used to know jurisdiction, and we knew, no, we can't touch that because that doesn't belong to us. That belongs to God. But it goes back to what we acknowledge in the Declaration. You have to be able to acknowledge that there is a God who's given rights. Government, your job is to protect those rights, not redefine those rights, not regulate those rights, not limit those rights. It's to protect the rights that God gave us. We used to understand that. That's what's been lost so much in our culture today. And this is something, as we talk about limited government, I'm a big fan of limited government. And by limited, I mean understanding the scope of what government does and what it doesn't do. And there's a lot of things we could talk about with this, and we might have a chance to do some of that later tonight. But this is something vital to us to understand, is the reason we created government, the purpose of government was to protect the rights that God had already given to us. And we acknowledge that there's a moral standard. And so even in government, it's okay to uphold that moral standard because we knew where the moral standard came from. And below that was the consent of the governed. If we are going to have a limited government, we can't be secular. And that's just the bottom line. Because either we believe that God meets our needs or government does. And right now, we've got an awful lot of Americans that think government's the one that's supposed to meet our needs. And that's just not the way it works. Government was not created to meet our needs. It was created to protect what God had already given us. And God's given us gifts and talents and abilities. And government's job is to protect the opportunity so that if we are willing to work hard, we can be productive. We can achieve, we can accomplish, because in America, the American dream, in fact, one of the best examples of the American dream is Ben Carson. Now, whatever you think about him politically, that aside, his story is the American dream. Growing up in the projects, his mom drops out of school, functionally illiterate, and by the way, if you don't know the story, it's really a remarkable story. She has 2 sons. Dad's gone, nowhere around. She's working multiple jobs, and she looks around the project and says, I don't want my sons. I don't want my sons to grow up living life like this, because she recognized that everyone that lives in the projects that was on welfare never got out of the projects and never got off welfare. She said, I don't want that for my sons. So Ben Carson was in 3rd grade, younger brother, she takes him to the library. Now, she's functionally illiterate. She can't read. She takes him to the library and says, I want you to pick out a book, bring it home. She has them read that book that week and turn in a book report. She can't read. She takes her book report, takes a pen, underlines some things, circles some words, gives it back to him and says, I think you can do better. She has no idea what she underlined or circled, but gives it back to him. She took him back to the library next week, and she had them do this for years. Well, they were the lowest academically testing in their grades at that point. Well, all of a sudden, they started increasing in their class standing. In 6th grade, Ben Carson was the smartest kid in his elementary school, actually began getting scholarships to go to some of these private schools. Well, he went on to become a neurosurgeon. In fact, the first doctor to ever successfully separate Siamese twins, his brother was actually someone who went on to become an astrophysicist for NASA, a literal rocket scientist. They've done pretty well. But it's not because of what the government gave them. It's because in America, we believe in opportunity. And if you're willing to work hard, there's no limit to what you can achieve. But it's not because government's our provider. It's because we had a government limited enough. She recognized government will never meet the needs that we have. We're never going to get out of here if we do this. Well, this is something we have to understand and realize. Government's job is not to meet the needs of people. Government's job is to protect the rights that God has given us. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, one of really remarkable things he said is actually one of the statements that's in stone in Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. He said this, and I'm going to close with this. He said, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm basis? Now, he's talking about liberties. Jefferson is a big freedom, big limited government guy. He says, can freedom be secure if we remove the foundation? What's the foundation? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath. If we have a government that doesn't understand our freedoms come from God, then government will violate those freedoms. And Jefferson said, if they violate those freedoms, it is to put ourselves in a place where we're going to incur the wrath of God. That's a scary place to be, and this is what Jefferson concluded. He said, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and His justice cannot sleep forever. He says, when government violates those rights, God's wrath will come, and God is just, and He won't sleep forever. Now, I'll tell you, as a nation, it's kind of a scary place to be today, Because there's a lot of things in the nation, we are not where we need to be. But I'll tell you, the reason we're not where we need to be is because we, as Christians and as Americans, have been on the sideline way too long. And that's the only, see, if we know what makes us a success, well, what we talked about tonight, this is the philosophy that made America exceptional. Well, do you know what? If you plant those same seeds again, you can grow the same fruit. Because it's the seeds that produce the fruit. We are not going to be discouraged in this moment. And I'm saying this knowing there's a giant that we are dealing with, multiple giants in America. But I am not a pessimist. I believe, I always want to be in numbers. When they sent out 12 leaders from the 12 tribes to go spy out the land, and they came back, 10 of them came back with a negative report and said, oh my gosh, it's hopeless, they're so big, there's no way we can do it. And Joshua and Caleb came back and said, no, I mean, there's giants in the land, but God. And I never want to be someone that forgets the but God, but I'm not going to stick my head in the sand and say there's not giants. There are giants in the land, but what I can tell you is the same God that brought down the walls of Jericho, that parted the Red Sea, is still on his throne today, and here's what I'll tell you, it's even more encouraging to me. We have a world and a culture that is desperately looking for answers. Desperate. And the only one that has the answers is us. This is the most exciting time ever because people are so ready to hear your voice giving the solution, and we have this. They're desperate for it. They want it so bad. I receive such warm receptions to college campuses. The kids love it. Why? Because I'm saying something nobody else is saying on their campus. No professor saying something. People are hungry for the truth, and this is what we have to remember, is that as we look around, darkness is filling culture around us. But darkness only represents the absence of light.
Amen.
Well, the way you expel darkness is you turn on the light. We can solve every one of these problems if we will turn on the light. So Jesus said, you are the light of the world. As we look at the problems in culture, we got to know we are the solution. We are the hope for this nation. But it's time for the church to wake up. Now, if you want to know more information, we have a great website, wallbuilders.com. I do have some product in the back, some really neat products. I'll tell you, the Founder's Bible to me is one of the coolest products we have because for 28 years we've been studying the Founding Fathers. We have over 100,000 original documents that predate 1812, from before 1812. We have original letters from George Washington, John Adams, Sam Adams, John Hancock, and Thomas Jefferson. Some amazing stuff. And the Founding Fathers were very open about their faith. And they talked about how the Bible shaped institutions and policies and organizations. And so what we did in this Bible is every time the Founding Fathers talked about how a verse or a policy or principle shaped what we were doing in America, we just took their quote and we put it beside that verse. And so in this Bible, there's 219 article inserts that take those Founding Fathers quotes and put them by the verses that really shaped it. One of the things that we're encouraging Americans is God has given us every answer we need in the Word of God. The problem is 95% of Christians have never read the Bible, Genesis to Revelation. So most Christians don't know the answer because they haven't even taken time to read the answer. So the first challenge is as Christians, we need to read the Bible because God's given us the answer. We need to know what the answer is. But one of the things that we encourage people is that not only do we want you to know the answer, we want you to see how the answer shaped American culture, American way of life, and made America exceptional. And that's one of the cool things this Bible does. We have all kinds of other products too, some really unique things I can tell you about any of these if you want to know about them. And I'm not just trying to push a product. I want to help equip people to know the truth because what our culture needs is truth. And we need Americans that know the truth. And this is where I want to finish tonight, is encouraging us. In the midst of our nation right now, we're trying to decide what leader is going to take us the right direction. Well, I can tell you, as a Christian, as someone who loves the Constitution, who cares about the U.S. Supreme Court and issues, those are things that motivate and dictate how I want to vote. Now, I'm not going to tell you who you need to vote for, although I can, and I might, maybe I should. We can talk about it later and be happy to. But the reality is, if you look at the philosophy that made America great, platitudes don't make America great again. A philosophy, understanding that there's a God who gave rights to man, governor's job is to protect those rights. God has a standard, and below that, we the people get to make decisions. If you have someone that understands that philosophy, we can once again plant the seeds that will make America exceptional, but we need to choose a leader who will do a good job representing what has made America special, so that once again, we can make America great again, but not because of a platitude or a slogan, but because of the principles of success. Thank you guys so much for your time. Pastor Greg.